Is Russia doomed if it keeps bleeding in the war with Ukraine? Could China step in and change everything? Former U.S. President Donald Trump thinks so, and many in China seem to agree. The logic sounds simple: China is the world's factory. If it throws its weight behind Putin, wouldn't that secure a swift Russian victory? But that view, while tempting, misses the deeper truth. The relationship between China and Russia is no fairy tale. It's a long, tangled history of rivalry, opportunism, and uneasy cooperation. Let's peel back the curtain and take a closer look, from imperial treaties and Cold War betrayals to today's strategic poker game. The idea that China could rescue Russia from the war in Ukraine has gained traction in recent months. But anyone betting on such an outcome would be wise to consider the past, not just the headlines of today, but the undercurrents of history that continue to shape both nations' actions. Let's start in 1689. That year, the Treaty of Nerchinsk was signed between the Qing dynasty and Tsarist Russia. It was the first formal border agreement between China and a European power. But it wasn't a handshake among equals, it was a survival pact, one that foreshadowed a pattern of Russian expansion and Chinese concessions. Over the next 150 years, Tsarist Russia seized nearly 6 million square kilometers of Chinese territory. That's about 3 times the size of the Xinjiang region. This wasn't just lost land. It was humiliation, a slow-burning insult etched into Chinese memory. In 1900, during the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion, Russian forces invaded China's northeast. They didn't just march in, they massacred. The tragedy of Heilongpo left 5,000 Chinese civilians dead. Monuments on the banks of the Heilongjiang River still mark the pain of that moment. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you'd think the Soviet Union might have taken a different approach. But in 1941, it signed a neutrality pact with Japan, effectively recognizing Japan's occupation of Manchuria. 4 years later, at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union struck a deal behind China's back, trading away Outer Mongolia in exchange for concessions from the Allies. Even after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, the Soviet Union hesitated to offer full recognition. When Mao Zedong visited Stalin in 1950, the two powers declared solidarity, but beneath the surface, mistrust lingered. Then came Korea. Kim Il-sung launched a surprise invasion of South Korea in 1950, backed by a secret telegram from Stalin. Beijing was not consulted. Instead, it was left to clean up the mess. The newly founded China, still recovering from civil war, was dragged into a brutal conflict against the United States. And while China eventually pushed back the U.S. forces, the episode left a lasting impression: the Soviet Union would exploit China when it suited Moscow's agenda. The so-called Sino-Soviet friendship didn't last much longer. In 1958, Khrushchev proposed joint control over naval bases and radio systems. To Mao, it felt like an attempt to reoccupy Chinese territory. He flatly rejected it. A decade later, the Zhenbao Island conflict erupted, bringing the two countries to the brink of war. 1 million troops lined the border. China, fearing nuclear escalation, launched a massive internal industrial movement, the Third Front, relocating key factories deep into the mountains at enormous cost. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, China's trust had long since evaporated. Meanwhile, Russia plunged into chaos. In 1992, its GDP dropped by nearly 15%. Inflation reached 2,500%. Foreign debt soared. And yet, instead of turning east, Moscow looked to the west. Under Boris Yeltsin, Russia pursued westernization. When Putin took over in 2000, the country's economy was fragile, with a per capita GDP under $800. Even so, Putin's early diplomacy leaned toward cooperation with the U.S. After the 9/11 attacks, he opened military bases in Central Asia to American forces. He even accepted NATO expansion into the Baltic states. So what changed? The pivot came with Crimea in 2014. The annexation of Crimea and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline brought Russia closer to Europe economically, but further from it politically. By 2021, German-Russian trade hit $80 billion. Washington took notice. According to a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, if Europe and Russia had deepened their energy alliance, they could have created a $30 trillion economic bloc by 2030. That kind of partnership posed a real threat to U.S. influence, and it partly explains NATO's renewed push eastward, which Putin saw as an existential threat. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. So where does China stand? On paper, China-Russia relations have never looked stronger. In 2023, their trade hit $240 billion. Over 80% of that was settled in local currencies. China now buys over 100 million tons of Russian oil per year, at a heavy discount, often $15 to $20 below global prices. But while the trade is booming, the support is surgical. China isn't handing over advanced weapons or game-changing technologies. Its tech exports to Russia grew just 12% in 2022. That's a far cry from India's 300% increase. Why? Because China is walking a strategic tightrope. It wants cheap energy and a distracted West. It does not want secondary sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or a long-term entanglement in a war it cannot control. Beijing is playing a long game, supporting Russia just enough to keep it afloat, but not enough to risk its own position. As for Russia, its war machine keeps grinding. In 2023, its defense budget surged to $110 billion, about 6.7% of GDP. The cost of war? Roughly $300 million per day. But even a resource-rich state has limits. So what happens next? There are three likely outcomes. First, Russia may fall into a drawn-out, Afghanistan-style quagmire, bleeding 5 to 7% of GDP each year in a low-intensity war. Second, the strain of sanctions and battlefield losses could trigger political upheaval inside Russia. And third, some kind of ceasefire could emerge, perhaps a deal granting autonomy to parts of eastern Ukraine. But that would come at the cost of strategic depth, leaving Russia more exposed than ever. No matter how it ends, one thing is clear: China will not be Russia's savior. It will be its business partner, its strategic chess player, and its careful observer. As Vladimir Putin once said, there are no eternal friends in geopolitics, only eternal interests. For China, the interest is survival. Economic growth. Global influence without global war. And in today's unpredictable world, that may be the smartest game of all.